And so the idea of using a mattock is to take away the sward. You're not trying to dig a hole, you're trying to just take away the grass so that you're clearing an area from weeds and root competition before you do the planting. If you go and have a look at commercial plantings, quite often they will be doing the same thing but with glyphosate. We don't really get on with that, but it is a lot of work, screefing. It's quite hard work. So if you want to avoid using glyphosate, you need your trusty mattock. When people get a mattock in their hands, they sometimes go a bit wild. So it's quite important to give the proper safety instructions. So people, when you're using this tool, you need to make sure that you're at least 3 meters away from other people. You need to not be raising the mattock above head height. You need to be making sure that you have a really good grip, not having slippy gloves or anything like that. And added to which, you need to be having your feet well apart so that you don't whack yourself with the mattock. And the other thing is that if people do go mattocking like that, in a wild and eccentric fashion, they will end up with bad backs. So really it's important to use the tool correctly. And I did promise you that I would show you a picture of poor mattocking behaviour. The only good thing about this picture is that at least they are a safe distance apart. So we'll give them that.
So, okay, we're going to plant a bare-rooted hawthorn. So we've got our bare-put patch of earth where the turf has been screefed off. Now, for the bare-rooted, it's best if the stakes aren't in, and you'll see why. But we want to imagine where our stake's going to be. Our stake's going to be between the direction of the prevailing wind and the tree. And the prevailing wind is southwest, which is roughly that direction. So we're going to imagine our stake is going to be there. And because our tree's bare-rooted, it's got quite a big root system, so we need a spade, and we're going to do the slit method of planting. So you want to get the spade in, at least a spade's depth, to get all the roots in. Then you need to widen your slit up a bit. Because these trees are bare-rooted, we want to make sure that until the tree's planted, to keep the roots protected and out of the wind. So, you just want to ease the roots in there. There we are. It's going to... Now we want to make sure the tree is really, really firm in the ground. So I'm just going to go around and really stamp in the ground around the tree. And now, just to double check, we always do this little test. We call this the tug test. And we just give it a tug like that, and now we can really feel the resistance of the ground holding on to the roots of that tree. So that's your tree planted.
So quite often when you get trees from the Woodland Trust, you're doing a little school planting or something like that, you'll get given spirals and bamboos. That is fine, provided you don't have any deer in your vicinity. If you have deer in your vicinity, that they will munch the trees. So these are very easy to use. You can just press the cane down and put the spiral over or wind it over. But they will protect against rabbits, but they won't protect against deer. So if you've got deer in your area, you're going to need either one of two things. Well, one of three things. One would be a gun, but quite often people are not very keen on shooting deer. Second would be a deer fence, which can sometimes be a really effective way of keeping deer out of a site, but you have to work out the economics of it. So it depends how many trees you're protecting with your fence and whether it's cheaper to use deer tubes or fencing. So we use quite a lot of these, and people do talk about one of the downsides of tree planting is the amount of plastic that gets used. I don't really think of these tubes as single-use plastic, because actually they're going to be on the tree for many a year, really. You want to keep the tubes on the trees until the trees are really filling the tube, and then you will have to go back and do the job of removing the tubes so that you don't leave a sort of legacy of plastic in the future. So you can't just sort of put these on and then just walk away from a planting. They're kind of something that needs long-term thinking about. What do I say about these? They usually come in packs of 5. So you will get different diameters of tube. So you can actually choose a tube that's going to fit your tree. If somebody's planted the tree a bit far away from the stake, then use an outside tube, so mix and match. Things that can go wrong in a planting with tubes. One is if people put a tube on when the tree's a bit too far from the stake, and they kind of twist it up the tube. So you need to make sure you really want to get the tree right in the middle of the tube as you're peeking down the tube. What other mistakes do they make when you're doing a planting? Putting the tubes on upside down. If you see here, there's a little flange at the top of the tube. And that's because when the tree's coming out of the tube and it gets caught by the wind, it's not going to be rubbing its bark. Whereas if it was on the bottom end of the tube, not so nice. Other things that people do wrong with tubes when they're at a public planting is you can get the tree trapped in the tie. That can happen. And the other thing is that people don't always pull the ties nice and tight. You want to get your tube really tight to to the stick so that it can't be blowing around. So that's something to look out for when you're doing the quality control on your tree plantings. Also, you need to be putting your stake in really firmly. One of the things that can go wrong is that people don't knock the stake in, and then it gets blown by the wind, and it's worse than useless, and you go back to the site and all the trees are blown over and kind of been pulled down. So it's really important. So if you, like us, live in an area where you've got a clay subsoil or a rocky subsoil, in order to get your stake in well, you can use this to make a nice deep hole. And then we like to use post knockers to put the stake in. We did start off by using lump hammers, which some groups do use lump hammers to put the stakes in. But then we found that because our soil is so stony and difficult, it's not like a huge, thick, nice loam, that we were getting repetitive strain injuries from all the vibrations of the lump hammers going up our arms, and that was causing us difficulties. So we use that tool instead.
So here we are, we have the root trainer trees. They come in packs of 15, and tell people to just take one at a time, because even though they have got a bit of soil around their roots, they're still vulnerable to drying out and the cold, you know, when it's a bit breezy. So this is a hazel. It's still got the remains of the hazelnut that it grew out of there. So there between my hands, there's the roots of the tree, and all those need to be buried securely in the ground. So I'm just going to put that there, where I'm not going to try and stand on it first. And this is a planting spear. It's a tool designed especially for the job of planting these particular trees. So it's a very good tool, but dangerous if used in the wrong manner. So the first thing to tell people is the proper manner, professional manner to carry their tool is by their side like that, and to never ever, never do this, because I'm sure you can imagine what could happen. So we're going to make a hole for the roots of our tree. First thing to think about is the position. So because the prevailing wind's coming this way, and we want the stake to be between the direction of the prevailing wind and the tree. And then when it's planted, wants to be not more than about 2 fingers width between the tree and the stake. Because if it's further away, it'd be very difficult to get the deer shelter on. So I always start off with that shoulder of the spear, or almost but not quite touching the stick. Yeah, and you want it to be in line with the flat side of the stick as well. And I do it by push a little bit, twist a little bit, push, twist. Checking that sometimes it starts to slide away, especially if the ground's sloping. So checking that we're still in the right position. I think that will be deep enough. If you give it a little twist as you pull it out, that loose soil should come out as well. And when you're not using your spear, be careful of your feet, but stick it up in the ground. So now, there we are. That's definitely going to be deep enough for my tree, not more than 2 fingers, adjacent with the flat edge of the stick. And again, make sure it's really firm in the ground. So, tug test.
Finally, mulch. Tree responsibility, we use newspaper pegged down with hessian. We don't always mulch the bare-rooted trees, but with the little cell-grown trees, we do tend to mulch because that just gives them the time to put their roots out and get their roots established in the soil. And also having mulch means that you're not getting into the realms of using glyphosate and things like that. But it is quite expensive, so we do tend to put quite a lot of effort into planting in the early stages so that we have less effort to go back and replant sites. Some people don't mulch at all, and they just accept that a certain proportion of their trees are going to die, and then they go back to sites and keep putting in new trees. So there's all sorts of different ways to do it, but we prefer to put effort in at the early stages so that we don't have to keep going back to sites.
Right, okay, mulch. So here we have a hessian sack and some newspaper. The idea is to cover up all the bare ground around the tree so it blocks out the light, which will inhibit the grass and weeds from growing back and competing with the tree for their resources, especially moisture. You can keep them whole. Oh, there's only 2 in here. Maybe not keep them whole. There's that awkward bit between the stick. You could do that in a number of ways. I prefer just to tear a bit off. Or you can get people to sort of take off a few sheets and scrunch them up and put them down there, but I prefer the tearing method. So, there you are. See, there's no bare ground around your tree. Yeah, and the tube bit you already know about, having the flange side up, cable tie over the stake, and guide your tree up inside, making sure it's not going to get trapped inside between the cable tie and the tube. And then we put the mat on and we open it out. It's a hole in the middle. We do this after the tube because these ragged edges, they can get caught on the little lateral branches of the tree. So that's why we put the tube on first and the mat after. Spread it out so it's covering all the paper. And then you need your planting spear again to dig it in at the corners. And then around the edge. Yeah, and tell people to make sure they're just going through the mat when they're doing this dibbing in, not the paper, because they'd be bad there for hours going like that, otherwise not getting you anywhere. But anyway, there's your tree, all planted and protected.
I'm going to run through some of the trees that we've got with us today and give you a little bit of a clue about how you might identify these trees. And the sort of issue is that when you get trees from a tree nursery, they look something like this, and they all look rather similar, but there are signs that you can tell, and we're going to start off with alders. And although this particular example is a little bit muddy, the easiest way to identify the alder tree its buds are slightly purpley red buds. And alders are great for a lot of things. They're good at nitrogen fixing. And so if you're doing a planting and you want to put them on the windward side so that the leaves blow over the site, that's a very good thing to help the rest of your planting get off. And the other thing I really like about alders is that they're very quick growing, so they're very obliging. You put them in the ground and they grow quickly, so that's kind of nice. So I'm very fond of the alder tree. Oh, one more thing about the alder is that it quite likes being in wet places, and it's also quite wind resistant as well. So next we have a kind of woodland staple, which is birch. Two main kinds of birch, silver birch and downy birch. We're in the Pennines, so the birch that's native to our area is the downy birch. Quite sort of delicate and little tiny buds. So sort of mid-brown, quite delicate little tiny buds. Another good thing about birch trees is the mycorrhizal associations. If you plant these, the relationship between the fungi and the trees. So we plant a lot of birch in coppice, hazel coppice, and the birch will help the other trees to get established and provide dappled shade, which is a very good thing to have in a coppice. So next we've got hawthorn. These are all still bundled together, and the easiest way to identify the hawthorn is by pricking your fingers on the hawthorn, which I've just done. So the good thing about hawthorn is it's a very good edging tree and very good for hedging. So here we've got a bundle of oak trees, bare-rooted oak trees. Oak are obliging to identify because they've got little clusters of buds all together or bunched together. And so they're one of the easiest trees to identify. They do come in two varieties, well actually more than two, but two main varieties that you get in England are English oaks and sessile oaks, and those are almost impossible to tell apart at the twig stage, you know, at the stage of the tree being this big, but these ones are actually sessile oaks, which are probably the right oak to use for the sort of South Pennines area. Good thing about oaks is they are quite deep rooted, and so if you've got a slope that's sort of unstable or something like that, you can sort of peg it in by planting oaks in it, because they're very good at sort of helping to stop landslides and things like that by pegging the soil down. Other thing is, if you're growing oaks, it's quite nice to spread them out over the site, because they're a good standard tree. So you'll quite often find oak and birch together in a woodland. The birch provide the shade, dappled shade for the oaks. They're quite slow growing oaks. Here's a bundle of rowan, actually. I'm a great fan of rowan trees. Not the most difficult tree to identify. They've got little furry bits on the buds. If you look closely, they're just slightly furry on the buds. And of course, beautiful trees, very nice for visual amenity, good for birds and all sorts of other things like that. A very pretty tree. I like a rowan tree. These trees here are wild cherry. Wild cherry have a kind of a chestnutty colour, pointy buds. But usually you will be able to identify all these different twigs from little nursery wrappers, which are kindly put round the bottom. So the idea of planting wild cherries and everything like that, really good for wildlife and diversity in a planting as well. So that's a good thing to do. Now then, we have some hazel trees, which the nursery have kindly made pretty difficult to point to their identifying features because they've trimmed the tops off. You will quite often get trees like this from a nursery. So it's really important to make sure that when you're healing in your trees, you make sure you know where you've healed in all the different species, because a typical beginner's mistake, which we have definitely made, is by forgetting to label all the trees, healing them in, and then, oops, can't quite remember which is which. So it's really important to make a good plan when you're healing in trees. So I do actually have some other hazel, because all the trees that I've shown you so far were all bare rooted. It's good to have a mix of bare rooted trees and cell grown trees when you're doing a public planting. Obviously, you can't always achieve that, but because when children turn up, it's nice to have easy trees for the kids to plant, essentially. And these get planted with a different tool. So whenever we do tree planting with schools, we always use cell-grown trees because they're easier. The other advantage of a cell-grown tree is that it's got a longer planting season, so you can really get away with planting these trees from the beginning of October to sort of mid-April time-ish, or later if it's wet, because their roots are contained, they've been grown in little containers, so that you don't get the root disturbance that you would get with a bare-rooted tree. So they're quite forgiving and easy to plant. And this one is a hazel. You can see that they've got quite small buds, otherwise quite difficult to identify, but they do tend to hold on to their leaves a lot in the winter, so sometimes there'll be a hazel leaf to help you, not in this case. Hazel are really good for coppicing, which is sort of cutting the tree so that it regenerates. And we use a lot of coppiced hazel as stakes for doing fascines for erosion control. which we'll talk about at a later weekend. But there's all sorts of things that can be made with hazel. And when you're planting a coppice or a hazel coppice, you would be planting at a greater density, usually 1.5 meters rather than between 2 and 2.5, because you want to have the trees crowded together so that they grow upwards, and you get the long stems that can then be cut, and they will then regenerate. And so that's hazel. We've also, in the cell-grown trees, we've also got some elder. Once again, beautiful tree, elderberry wine, elderflower wine. You can make cordial as well if you're that way out. And elderflower fritters, actually, I've had, which are really nice. And obviously they're beautiful too. So a bit of beauty doesn't go amiss in this world. So how to identify them? They've kind of got slightly knobbly, speckly stems, and they also quite hard to keep. They do tend to break off. These have been healed in, and some of them they don't particularly like being healed in very much. Okay, that's the elder. Once again, for beauty, we've got some red oaks to give a bit of variety in the planting. And red oaks, like the other oaks, have clusters of buds. There's a cluster of buds there, you might be able to see it. And but they can have a sort of reddish stem as well. We've got a few beech. And beech have very sort of sharp, pointy buds, quite spiky looking buds. It's important not to plant beech on steep, sloping valleys. If you go into the Calder Valley, you'll see a lot of areas where beech were planted because they made very good rollers for the mills. The wood was very good, but they planted them in all the steep clefts. And now that the beech are very shallow rooted, and when they grow up and get very heavy, they keel over, and so can cause quite a big erosion problem. The other thing with beech is that they do cast a lot of shade, so they're not very good for the understory. But they are a lovely tree. I mean, they are a beautiful tree. So I think you have to sort of plant them in moderation and spread them out a bit. But definitely don't plant them on steep slopes, because in sort of 100, 200 years, they're going to keel over and bring the slope down with it. We have holly, and holly quite often gets grown in pots. I think the main thing to be aware of with holly is it doesn't like getting planted on frost or with a lot of wind. They're quite tender, so it's important to get them into the ground as soon as possible, and not plant them if it's a frosty day or anything like that, because they are particularly tender. You can also actually get away with planting holly later in the year than most trees. You can sort of plant them in May and things like that, and obviously they're really easy to identify, so everyone will identify the holly. There's a couple of trees I haven't got in this talk. The first one is willows. Willows are good for wet areas, and they're also you can grow them from cuttings. Tree Responsibility, we grow a lot of Viminalis willow from cuttings. which we then use to make natural flood management, living willow revetments to slow the water down. So they can be a very useful tree. And the other tree I should mention that that we do plant quite a lot of is blackthorn, but blackthorn tends to spread. It's very beautiful, beautiful blossoms, slows, very nice, but it does tend to spread and sucker. So I thought in a camping area, which is where we're going tomorrow, that probably wouldn't be an appropriate tree to put in.